I was brought up in a Christian church, rather similar to this. It was a small church, Church of Christ, and I liked the stories of the Bible, but nothing else really much touched me. And at middle teens, about 14, I started to ask questions of the minister, not the minister, never got that far, the Sunday school teacher that we had. I'd asked him questions and I found that he couldn't answer, so I left. But my interest in God, my feeling that God was central, was absolutely the central point in one's quest to know the meaning of life. That continued. And I would go to any group, talk to anyone, or read anything in order to gain more knowledge of this. I was in the services during the war, and then because of that I was able to go to the university. Otherwise I wouldn't have gone. My family are not university people. Very simple people. My father was a salesman, my mother was a dressmaker. But I went to university, and my brother-in-law, I have one sister, she was 5 years older than me, she is 5 years older than me, married, and my brother-in-law also went to the university the same day to register, and he said to me, I'm going to do psychology. I said, that'll do. That's fine by me. I had no idea. All I knew was that I didn't know what to do in life, and it was an easy escape. And the government paid me. So I started psychology. Well, I soon became very thoroughly disillusioned because I did not find in the study of psychology what I was looking for, and that was the relationship of God to life. The relationship of God to creation. It just wasn't there. And when the professor finally said in the middle of my second year, we're not concerned, somebody else asked him about God. He said, we're not concerned whatsoever with God. We are only concerned with the 5 senses. I thought, that's it. But at that point, Barbara must have taken pity on me, because I was, through a friend of my sister's, I was invited to meet some people who belonged to what I found out was called the Sufi Society. It was an organisation started by a saint, Inayat Khan, in the around 1920s, to study love for God through the path of Sufism, which was it's a heart doctrine, put it very simply. And although I liked the people, it didn't mean that much to me. But I subsequently met the leader of the society in Australia, Baron von Frankenberg, and he was an outstanding figure for me at that time, certainly. Very, very learned, very well read, very charismatic. He had quite a presence about him, and I thought, yeah, this chap has got something. So I said, yes, I'd like to study under you. And the first evening I went to, which was a beginner's lesson, you could say, in Sufism. At the end of the evening, I was given a small book, and said, I was told, you might like to read this. I said, fine. As usual, I took it home and started reading. As soon as I opened it and started to read, I felt here was what I had been looking for. I didn't know anything about him, and it was simply, perhaps all I could really say is that I felt the truth of what this man, whoever he was saying in this book of discourses. Discourses that tackle so openly and completely the questions that I was fumbling, gropingly expressing to myself what was God, where did he fit in, how did creation happen. As a child I can remember, silly games like, well, if God created the universe, who created God? Imagining as I had the impression from the church that God was up there somewhere in the heavens. He was separate from the creation. He was the creator. But Barbara, all of a sudden, here it was, that all these things were tackled openly, intelligently, and in English. It wasn't even a translation, which I had. Can you still hear me all right? Good. So I continued to read the discourse, and the more I read, the more I found out about MeherBaba, the more drawn I was to him, and that feeling that, yes, here was my spiritual master. It's an interesting story. When so often in talking to people who have also come to MeherBaba like myself, they'll say, if such and such hadn't happened, this wouldn't have occurred, and this wouldn't, and then because of that, I heard of MeherBaba. All these things, there's no question that where we have a connection with MeherBaba, and he is the central part of our very being, of course we'll hear about him. When we start to question, when we start to say, in effect, who is MeherBaba? And we start to get the answer that he is that one which provokes that very question in one. He is the being of all beings. So, and then that happened with myself in coming to my first meeting with Baba. That quite oh, thanks. Thanks, Karen. Quite an interesting series of happenings that brought about my move from Melbourne to Sydney with some money in my pocket for the first time in my life. I was married then to my first wife with 2 children. And the day I arrived was the day that an invitation arrived from MeherBaba in India saying that males over the age of 16 who loved him could go to see him in India in September. I said, wow, this is for me. Wild horses wouldn't have kept me away. At this time, I was very deeply, you could say, if you like, in love with MeherBaba and with his name, which, of course, I had established very early years back, and that was the path, the Sufi path, the name of God. But here was the living name of God. He was now living. There's no question that if you call on God in any name with sincerity and love, he'll respond. But that reminds me of a nice story. It's very touching. I mean, to me, I think how beautifully Baba handled it. This young Indian boy, as a child, developed a love for the name of God as Malhar. I don't know. I've never heard it myself. I don't even know what it means. Malhar. And he had this love for saying the name of God, and he, as Malhar, and he continued to do so. And then later in life, he was stationed. He was in the railways, and he was stationed at the city where MeherBaba was living nearby. And he heard of MeherBaba, and he at some occasion he had the opportunity of meeting Baba, and he fell in love with Baba. But here then the conflict continued. How to reconcile the name of God as Melha and his growing love for Baba, who he was accepting more and more as God himself in human form, and therefore the name of God. Desperate, finally he wrote to Baba and said, What should I do? I'm sorry, I can't remember the words of the letter, but never mind. What will I do? Here I have this love for this name of God, Melha, and at the same time I have a love for you. What to do? And Baba had one of his close disciples write back to him and said, all will be resolved. Don't worry. My nazar is on you. When you come to the next opportunity, when you see me, the next opportunity that you have, when you stand before me, say aloud the name of Melha. And in which he did. And of course, that became his name of God. Baba himself, God himself, accepted that name as the name of God, which he then had the freedom to continue to use. So finally I arrived in Sydney, as I said, and that day, the day of the invitation came, and so I travelled to India. I had just had my 30th birthday, 1954, and my first view of Baba was in the midst of an immense crowd that had come to see Baba. He had said that he would be available to all who would like to come to see him. I don't know whether you know the Indian term, to have his darshan, and that is to offer one's love to him and receive his blessings, and particularly his love blessings in the form of some little gift that Baba would give to each one. In the case in 1954, it was a little handful of sweets which he would give to each one. So my first view, I was standing on the dais which had been built for Baba, and looking down as the car was driven up, and Baba, the door was open, and MeherBaba was brought out, and the way in which, the gentle way, the unassuming stance that he had, the very touch of his hand on the hand of one of the elder men with him, who was assisting him from the car, saying, "I don't need it, it's all right." But the way in which he did it, even that simple gesture, and the way in which he was with each, as he walked from the car to the dais, was such a symbol of loving kindness, of gentleness, of loving kindness, of thoughtfulness. And I was fascinated. I didn't swoon. I didn't keel over with emotion. I was just fixed at this figure, that here was God. I accepted him. What? I accepted him as my master. I accepted him intellectually, you could say, as God, but I don't know what that means. I'd have to be God myself to know if he's God. But I can't imagine who else he could be. Such were the qualities that he exhibited constantly. The very presence. I remember thinking, sort of being aware that he could, for example, he would know one's thoughts. He would know what one was thinking. Why wouldn't he? It was so natural. And he has proved that many times with myself. And I remember thinking, when I've been in his presence, thought, I better watch my thinking, you know. I better not remember that luscious cream cake that that I want or something. But I tell you, I can honestly say that everything disappeared in his presence. That I was so much at home with him that every other home had disappeared. His presence was such, it was so warm, embracing, accepting. So that a one-pointed attention to him was very easy, was effortless. And yet at the same time, he was also extremely stimulating. That one felt a great alertness. Are you still going to be able to hear me? I'm not using a mic because it's easier for me, but it is. The room seems good. I'm talking naturally, and it does seem to be throwing out all right. Good.
There are seats up closer.
If you have any difficulty, come up closer. Yeah. So that was my first sight of Meher Baba. Then he came round and came up on the dais and sat on the seat, facing this vast crowd. Now there were with me 17 other Westerners, other men who had come with me at the same time as myself, that they had also answered Baba's invitation to come. And we were seated in a semicircle on chairs behind Meher Baba, who was seated in front of us, 10 or 12 feet, perhaps 15 foot. It's hard to visualise now, 45 years later. I can still see it, but I can't quite get the distance. So he sat, and all of a sudden he turned and looked at each of the men. I was third in line, and turned a little more, and then that was my first meeting with Baba. His eyes locked into mine, and it was as though I felt an electric shock through the whole of my body, and it was as though it was like a shaft, you could say. And thinking about afterwards, it was as though his eyes had pierced me like an arrow and had pinned me to the wall and said, "Got you." And that was the sense. I had that feeling of absolute, total acceptance, but piercing in the sense that he knew all about me and had, accepted me. And then he moved on. I don't know. I don't remember much of the next few minutes. But then the program began, and the men and women, the Indians they say it was about 70,000. I don't know, but there were certainly crowds, throngs of people. They all filed before Baba, and as they filed, Baba would give them this handful of sweets. And of course, in that contact, in that touch that he had, was the touch of God. That was his blessing to them. And it was beautiful watching him, how he never missed anything. You never thought that he would, but he would be suddenly aware of somebody being pushed back with the people trying to get to him, and his hand would go through and still give them that touch. And again, you're aware of those that obviously had some greater degree of love, I don't know, but all I know is that he would stop sometimes and would stroke the face of somebody in such a loving way. It was very, to see their face light up was very moving. So that day passed, and then we had the next day was a day of rest. We settled into our quarters at one of MeherBaba's ashram, his main ashram, and that's where his tomb shrine is now. It's called MeherBabad, and it's on the Deccan Plateau, inland from Bombay. The third day, MeherBaba came and gave interviews to each of us. And in my case, there were 3 Australians had come. I was one of the 3. There were another young man, myself, and an older man whom we accepted who had already met Baba on another occasion, and whom we accepted as being the leader in Australia, Francis Brabazon, a poet. And when the interview occurred, we sat in front of Baba, and I was able to see him close up, and as it were, in an intimate way. And I noticed that if I said anything to him, he looked at me as I look at another person to person, and yet his eyes were such that you felt that he was seeing you as a person and answering you, but he was also seeing in you. And you felt that he knew you completely. And at the same time, it was occupied, those eyes were occupied with something far greater than the speck of dust or sand that was before him. They were fathomless. They were very beautiful eyes in the sense that they were like a moving sea. There was a movement often in the eyes, and it was like light moving on moving waters. I don't know whether, with a gentle movement, and you get the change in light and shade. Very, very beautiful, but at the same time, suddenly become very sharp and would look at you. When I asked, would he come to Australia, he looked at me quite sharply and said, "Do you think I'm not already there?" I said, "Yes, Baba." And that was the only time I ever asked him a question, by the way. I sort of had it gave me the sense that he knew all about things. There was no need to ask him questions. He'd give whatever was needed, whatever was needed and required in his time. He asked me whether the 3 of us, whether we loved him. Yes. And then he would look at me and say, "Are you prepared to obey me?" And I said, "Yes." And he asked me 3 things, and I'm sorry I don't remember 2. I only remember the first one, which was, would I walk through the streets of that city where we were located naked, if he asked me to? And I said yes. And I was quite prepared to do it. I mean, as far as I was concerned, I had accepted him. That's all I can say. But he never asked me. And there were two other questions. I've got no idea what they were. Anyway, I said yes. Then he told me to spread his name and message. He told me various things. He told me to take over a house that Francis Brabazon, the poet that I mentioned, the older man, he had started building a house which Bill has mentioned as being Meher House. Baba told me to take that over, which was very handy because I had spent the money that was needed to start building again on coming to see him. And it was his thoughtfulness. Baba never missed anything. And I've never known any Baba lover to starve. I've never known anyone to you could say, to die, to exist in poverty or in extreme difficulty. It doesn't mean... I'm not saying that one doesn't suffer normally. He doesn't change one's destiny. He doesn't relieve one of one's sufferings. But he gives one the inner strength to fight the battle of life. He gives one that support that will enable one, as long as one goes forward to him, he will never fail to respond. But one has to take that step. In Sufi tradition, there's a saying, a beautiful saying, take one step towards God and he'll take 10 towards you. And I can only say in my own life with him that this is so. When I've been in difficulties, it's because I've run ahead of Baba. I've forgotten. I thought, God will do that, without sort of taking his name and saying, well, if it's right, it'll come about. So the interview passed, and so there were many experiences that I had during that time in 54. In 1950, when I returned to Australia, then I continued to build that house that had been started but had been nowhere finished. And that house was the first house that Baba stayed in when he came to Australia in 1956, and which subsequently became known as Meher House, and is a place of pilgrimage for people. In 1958, when Baba came again, we felt Francis and the group, there was a small group of us, but if we moved the place where he stayed further north, where the climate would be warmer, because he was coming in June, which is our middle of our winter. So we obtained a property north of Brisbane. Perhaps I should divert for a moment and say the east coast of Australia, where 3/4 of the population lives, the north state is the state of Queensland and the capital is Brisbane. The middle state is New South Wales and the capital is Sydney, and the southern state is Victoria and the capital is Melbourne. And that's where I was born, Melbourne. And I moved to Sydney, and that's where from there I moved. I saw Baba and then came back to that house that was being built there. And in 1958, Baba came again. Now this was after his second car accident. His first car accident was in America, in the middle, bang in the middle of America. And he had said prior that he would spill his blood on the soil of America, and that's what he did. He suffered injuries down the left side of his body, broken leg, various other injuries. The main one I remember was the leg. In 1956, he had his second car accident, again very inexplicable. It was an open road, there was no other vehicle involved. His right hand, Erich Jesawala, just as Jesus had, Peter was Jesus' right hand, his chief disciple, so Erich is Meher Baba. Erich was driving the car, an experienced driver of many, many years, and all of a sudden the car just went out of control, turned over and landed in a ditch. One disciple died. Baba was again injured, but down the right side, and the injury was a broken nose and the joint of the leg was fractured, where, the pivot, sorry, you doctors can help me out. So the doctor said he wouldn't walk again, in actual fact he did, and he came to Australia in 1958 after the second car accident. But that image of Barbara is very real and very poignant to me. I drove down to collect him at the airport before driving him from Brisbane to Avatar's abode, the place we had purchased for his stay. And I can see now, I can relive very clearly how MeherBaba came from the plane, and it was the light. It was a very primitive airport then. Brisbane was much smaller than it is now, and the light was over the gate where I was standing, but the rest of the tarmac was in darkness. And out of that darkness came MeherBaba with his hand on Erich's arm, and one couldn't help but be aware of his fragility, of the obvious pain that he suffered as he walked. And although I'd always been aware, I'd not only had read, but I'd already seen Barbara, and I was aware that God-man, God in his manifestation, each time he comes, he always suffers. Why? He suffers to relieve some of the suffering that we have burdened ourselves with, mankind has burdened themselves with. He doesn't take it away completely, but such is the burden that we have created through our ignorance and our inhumanity to humanity. He relieves some of that, because otherwise we would be devastated once we realise what we had done, or the consequences would be such. So he suffers, and the suffering takes different forms at each time he manifests. As the Prophet Muhammad, he was injured. His blood was drawn through stones being thrown at him in battle. Jesus, as you know, the ministry was such a short one, but so intense. He was crucified. And so forth. Each time he comes, he suffers for us. And I could see that was even so much more visible and potent. And then Erich called. I was transfixed. I was just watching these two figures coming out of the darkness and into the light. And I was sort of just, as it were, sort of stunned. And Erich broke the spell by saying, "Bill, come and meet your beloved." So I ran forward, and just to show me that Barbara was still Barbara, he gave me a thump on the back that shook me from head to foot, sort of saying, "Don't think that I'm just a frail man." And so we drove from Brisbane to Avatar's abode, and we had the period of stay there, where he emphasised, it was as though in 1956, it was as though he was like a loving father with children who had just come to him. He played games with the children. He joked with us. He took us to the pictures on one occasion. That was an interesting little excursion. I drove him into the city with there must have been about 30 of us, 35 of us, something like that. And we booked the seats in this film. We went up to the balcony. We booked on the balcony, and we went up, and Barbara stood in the middle of the seats and directed where each of us would sit. And I didn't hear, but one of the other Barbara people heard two men, one saying to the other, God, who does he think he is? Jesus Christ. In Australia, you sort of, you don't get that sort of thing of telling people where they sit. Yeah. And we didn't know, we had no idea of the film. We picked the film blindly. So we sat down, and I'm seated here in one seat, and Barbara's in the row at an angle just to the next row down. And the film started, and I've got no idea now what it was about, but it wasn't a film I could be bothered watching, so I thought, I'll close my eyes. I'm here with Barbara, I'll just think of Barbara. So I sat and closed my eyes, and the next minute I feel a hand tapping my knee. And I open my eyes, and it's Barbara's hand, and he's looking at me nodding, saying, yeah, I could tell what he was saying. Yes, the film's not worth watching. And sure enough, after, I don't know, a short time, we all got up again and left. I don't know what the men thought. Because once Barbara got up, we all got up. He liked Sydney. When I drove him through the streets of Sydney, and I drove him along the shore, the seashore, on another occasion, and he liked it. He seemed to like his own creation.
Well, in LA, was there any place he said he didn't like?
Any place no, not that I've heard of. That's true. That always he would have liked the whole of his creation, but perhaps certain ones appeal to him more. And it's interesting, that sort of brings up an interesting point to me. Why go to his tomb shrine, for example? Why go to Meher House, which he has said is a place of pilgrimage? Isn't God everywhere? Of course he is. He's everywhere and within each of us. He's nowhere but within one's own heart. Why should we go? But it's an interesting question. I like to think of it as the universe as being like a huge house with many rooms. But the owner of the house, as we do, have special places where we like to sit. We like to be there more than other places. And that to me is those places that he has designated as a place of pilgrimage. That he is more there, that we feel him there. And to continue that figure, I like the figure that Erich gave once. He said that going to a place of pilgrimage is like taking the bloodhound to the scene of the crime. You pick up the scent of the quarry and set off again. And that's the feeling that one does have. That living in the world, it's so easy to forget God and forget what the purpose of life is. As Barbara says, to live for God and die for God. To love him, and the best way to love him is through love for one's fellow beings, even at the cost of one's own happiness. But in going there, one again is awakened to that purpose and says, yes, I've forgotten for the moment, I'll start again. So it's good to go often. That's what I do. So, and as I said, Barbara had told me to each time he saw me, he said, spread my name and message, tell others about me, give them my love, teach them how to love me, and this and that. I mean, various ways he had of expressing, and I tried. Nothing. And I'll skip 1962 for the moment. I'll go to 1967, and that was the last time I was with Barbara. I lived with him in his other ashram called Meherazad for 2 weeks. And he, while I was there, that was when he told me to develop the main centre in Australia, which he had named Avatar's Abode, as a place of world pilgrimage. And I said, yes, Barbara. And then he said, and spread my name and message. Now this time he said it very emphatically and strongly and repeatedly. And I was so conscious of his deteriorating physical health. And he would come into the place. It was sort of like a simple hall. It had been a stable for a horse that had been there. But it had been made into a very simple room with simple floor and a chair for Barbara. And we sat on the floor. They were the Mundley, the close disciples of Barbara. I was the only visitor there. But the close disciples were just sitting on the floor and I was amongst them. Barbara was very nice that occasion too. This was typical of how he always put one at your ease. He looked at me when he first came. We were standing, of course, as Barbara was brought into this long room. And he sat down and then we sat down. I was amongst the disciples and Barbara said, Bill looks just like one of them. So that immediately, I might look like one, but it's a different matter. To live with God is to see him from time to time is one thing, and to love him. But to be with him continually, I take my hat off to those close disciples. I'd love to be closer to Barbara, but somehow I'm not up to being with him day in and day out, and that means 24 hours a day. Anyway, that's another story. But at least he put me at my ease, and I was there with him. And so the days went by, and oh, that's right, and he would come in, and sometimes it would be said that his temperature during the night was 104 degrees. But he would say, yes, but I came because of Bill and because of Avatar's abode. So this weight of the responsibility of what he asked me to do grew heavy upon me. And one morning, later in the 2 weeks, encouraged by Erich, I burst out in a sort of fashion and said, Barbara, while I'm willing to do it, I'm not the man for you. You need somebody much bigger than me to do what you asked to do. Because although I had made efforts to spread his name and message, no new people had come as a result of it. Extremely few. And Barbara looked at me and said, all right. He didn't say. He looked at me and he went like this. And that meant he turned the key. In other words, it was going to happen irrespective of what I did. And not only did he relieve me of that, and it's a fact that from the day I arrived back in Australia, where I had been knocking on doors and saying, please let me tell you about MeherBaba, they were knocking on my door. It's a literal fact. From that moment, I got newspaper articles, radio talks, TV interviews. It never stopped, whereas I'd got nothing before. All he did was he turned the key. But he also, I had said yes to development, but I had no money, and the group was very small and very poor. We haven't got much now, but I had considerably less then. And one day, out of the blue, Barbara said to me, if you ever need money, come to me and I will see to it. And soon after I returned from Australia, I had no idea, it wasn't conscious at all, I started a business. I'm a psychologist by background, and I had earned enough as a psychologist for the family to send the children to, school and college and university, etc. But I went into business, and boy, that business flourished. I'm not a businessman, but by Barbara's grace, it turned over millions, which was very good in Australia. Mightn't be much in America. in 1954, when we were with him, that is those 18 men, I was one of them, the 18 Western men that were with him, and Barbara was giving a discourse. And at a certain point, it was just a sort of a momentary pause in the discourse, and his head slightly inclined, and he looked sideways. His eyes moved, and there was such an incredible, poignant, sad, reflective a look. It was so beautiful. That's all I can say. I don't know what words to describe the look of those eyes. And I just involuntarily thought within myself, oh, Barbara, stay like that so I can look at that, look at you as you are. And Barbara suddenly said, we'll stop the discourse and you can all look at me for 5 minutes. It's a fact. And I never thought at the time, it was only afterwards I thought, my God knew what I was thinking. You know, it was so natural and he assumed that exact position. And it was very moving for me. And that what came to me then, in those few minutes that he sat, was he was the homeless one, and all he wanted was a home in each one's heart. The central point of his teaching is love God. Love God above all. And the best way to do that is to love one's fellow beings, just the same as Jesus said. The message is the same. I mean, if you read the story of Ram, of Krishna, of Buddha, Muhammad, it's all the same thing. There's no question that in an intellectual way, when I read that 52 years ago, when I started to realise and I delve into these other scriptures, other major books, I realised it's the same message. And it's the same being. You can feel it's the same being. Love one's fellow beings even at the cost of one's own happiness. Be happy in their happiness. Suffer in their suffering. Think of me, remember me, because I will help you. Because it is difficult. It's not easy. It's easy to say love one's fellow beings. Yeah. But, you know, the boss does something or one's neighbour does something and one's thoughts are not loving.
What did he say about religion?
He would, I mean, if I were to go to him and say, Father, I'm a Roman Catholic and I want to continue as a Roman Catholic, I would say, fine, but be a real Roman Catholic. The teaching's the same. So really follow Jesus' teachings. But otherwise, religion, unfortunately, religions become simply a body of dogma and ceremonies that have got nothing to do with love for God. And that's what I experienced as a boy. That's why I left the church. Because suddenly I realised I wanted answers and it wasn't there. It's natural that people say, but I want to be able to go to somebody and say, what do I do? And they hope will say, do this and this and this. But God told us, He's given us the words. He's told us what we should do. The message is, but He has made it easy for us by that simple message, love me, think of me, remember me, read about me, talk about me, not because I'll change your destiny, not because I'll relieve your suffering, but because I will give you that inner strength to fight the battle of life. And it is a battle, isn't it? I think we all can experience that. It's all very well to say be loving, be kind, be tolerant, be gentle, be this and that, but my God, one's own nature, the weight of one's mental impressions are such that it's very difficult. But it can be done.